My name is Caitlin Brandt, and we have Dave Seaburn here today, who is our turtle expert and will be presenting. So just a little bit about what's going to happen today. This is the Help the Turtles webinar, as you can see. And this webinar will be recorded and available on CWF's website. And the easiest way to find this, if you have internet troubles throughout it or have to go for some reason, is to Google CWF webinars. And we have all of our past webinars there. So next slide, please. So we generally don't use the chat at our webinars because the settings will not allow everyone to see your comments, questions, or responses. So we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. From there, you can ask questions, any comments you have, and we'll tell everyone about them, and I'll pose the questions to Dave at the end. We also have the raise hand feature. So you can raise your hand at the bottom there, and from there we can unmute your screen and you can ask Dave the question yourself if you prefer it that way. But we will be doing that at the end. So next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to go through a bit about what CWF does. The Canadian Wildlife Federation is one of Canada's largest conservation organizations, undertaking projects and conservation across the country. Our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife and habitats. And we do this in a number of ways. One is through engaging the public and youth in citizen science, like using iNaturalist Canada, which is managed by CWF, and through education programs like Wild Outside and the Canadian Conservation Corps. And I'm an alumni of that program and I really recommend it. We also have specific projects in freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environments, many of which target species at risk, like the right whale, the Blandings Turtle, which I'm sure you'll hear about today, at-risk bats, and the monarch butterfly. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dave.
All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming to our turtle webinar. Today I'm going to be talking about why turtles are so much at risk, the various things that we at the Canadian Wildlife Federation have been doing to help the turtles, and various things that all of us can do to help turtles. So I'm expecting the presentation to last about 45 minutes, and there'll be time for questions at the end. All right, to start with, in Canada, we have 8 species of freshwater turtles. And we have 6 of those species in the Ottawa area or Eastern Ontario, where our office is based. So that includes the painted turtle, the most common and widespread species across Canada, the mighty snapping turtle, the magnificent northern map turtle, which is found in large rivers and lakes, the eastern musk turtle or stinkpot, which is rarely seen because it does not bask out of the water very often, the extremely rare spotted turtle, and last but not least, the beautiful Blandings turtle, which is one of our main focuses of our conservation program. So in addition to these 6 species, there are 2 others, the spiny softshell and the wood turtle, both of which are found in Ontario and some other areas, but they're not found in Eastern Ontario and not part of our work. So as I said, we have the 8 species of turtles or freshwater turtles in Canada, and the federal government has a species at risk assessment process to assess species and determine if their populations are declining and whether those species are at risk. And within that at-risk category, there's 3 different levels, which you can think of as low, medium, and high. So the lowest level of being at risk is special concern, then there's threatened, and the highest level is endangered. And as you can see on this slide, all 8 species of freshwater turtles in Canada are now species at risk according to the federal government. So this makes turtles one of the most endangered groups of species in Canada. And that's something that not many people are aware of, and even not many wildlife biologists think of turtles as being so much at risk. And this raises a question as to why are turtles so much at risk compared to other species? So the first thing to stress is that turtles are not delicate little creatures. They are tough. They are survivors. So turtles as a group have been around since the time of the dinosaurs, over 200 million years, which is pretty impressive to think about. So the dinosaurs went extinct, but the turtles survived, which is kind of an interesting idea to think about. Unfortunately, the life history traits of turtles, which have worked so well for millions of years, are not working so well in our modern world. And basically, there are three co-evolved traits that turtles have that put them at risk in our modern world. So first of all, turtles typically have delayed maturity. And this is particularly the case here in Canada at the northern extent of their ranges. So for many of our species, it can take 10 or even 20 years for a turtle to be full grown and mature and ready to breed. That's a very long time to have to survive before you can breed and replace yourself. Second of all, turtles typically have high egg and hatchling mortality. It's just part of their life history strategy. It's worked well, but it doesn't work well when there are additional threats on the species. And the third and probably biggest factor is that turtles are well adapted to very low rates of adult mortality. The amazing shell of a turtle is extremely protective once you get to be a good size. And so turtles have very, very low rates of adult mortality, but this has changed in a civilization with cars and many, many roads. So unfortunately, many turtles get killed on the roads. And the mathematical modeling around turtle populations is very clear that even a 2 or 3% increase in the adult mortality rate can cause a population to decline if that increased mortality continues. So you can imagine a population of 100 adults, 100 adult turtles, and if only 2 of them get killed on the road every year, that's enough for the population to decline over time. So in 2017, the Canadian Wildlife Federation began a turtle conservation project in Eastern Ontario. We're involved in a lot of actions around turtle conservation, but I'm going to only talk about 3 of our main priorities for the turtle conservation program. And so number 1 is conducting surveys for the Blandings turtle and trying to find previously unknown populations. Number 2, working to reduce road mortality of turtles. And number 3, working to increase reproductive success to try to bolster those populations. So for most of the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about those 3 broad categories of things that we've been doing over the past few years. Just to get everyone oriented, here's a map of Southern Ontario. You can see Toronto, and Ottawa is up here in Eastern Ontario. So most of our work occurs either in Western Ottawa or areas to the west or southwest of that area, within about a 2-hour drive of the city of Ottawa. So our first main priority has been conducting wetland surveys for Blandings turtles. And this involves going into wetlands and actually trying to find a Blandings turtle at that site. And why do we do that? It's important to know where these species at risk are if we want to help them. But there's another more fundamental reason, in that in the province of Ontario, we have the Ontario Endangered Species Act, and that provides habitat protection to threatened and endangered species. So if we go into a wetland and find a Blandings turtle in a new area, that wetland and areas around it will receive some form of protection. So that's an overall benefit for the species. So how do we do that? Well, as you can see Chris here in the photograph, we don our bug hats in the springtime, we have our binoculars, and we're either walking around wetlands or sometimes wading right through them, trying to find a Blandings turtle like this, basking on a hummock in the middle of the wetland. Sometimes this is quite easy. Sometimes you can spend hours searching and not find a Blandings turtle. This is an example of a good-looking swamp with lots of downed logs in it and the kind of habitat that Blandings turtles like. If you look very carefully in this photograph, you will see there is a Blandings turtle basking on a log. And this is exactly what we're looking for. I'll give you a couple of seconds to scan the photograph to see if you can find the turtle. And sometimes it's easier knowing the fact that it's already on one of these logs, because we don't always know that. And here's the turtle basking on a log. You can see the yellow chin and throat, meaning it's a Blandings turtle. So at this point, we would try and get a closer photograph of the turtle and take a precise measurement of the location using a GPS. And that's all we need to protect that habitat. So we've been doing this for the past few years, and so far we've protected almost 90 square kilometers of wetland habitat. So this obviously benefits the Blandings turtles, but it also benefits the plants, the insects, and the animals that make use of these wetlands. So in one sense, the Blandings turtle is kind of an umbrella species which can help to protect habitats for many different species. The second main category that we've been working on is trying to reduce road mortality. And if turtles stayed in one particular wetland, road mortality would not be a threat, and turtle populations would probably be doing very, very well. But turtles leave the wetland and move over land for a number of reasons. In the nesting season, which is typically in June, adult females are leaving the wetlands and they're looking for a place to lay their eggs. And so often that means having to cross a road with the risk of being hit by a car or a truck. In early springtime, so in many areas, that's going to be right around now, April, or even in late March in the warmest parts of Canada, turtles will be leaving the wetlands where they spent the winter and possibly moving to another wetland in the springtime that's more conducive for the habitat they want in the springtime. And so throughout the summer, you can have turtles moving from one wetland to another. There could be a spring wetland, a midsummer wetland, and one they prefer in late summer before moving back to the wetland where they want to spend the winter. And so every time a turtle leaves a wetland and goes to another wetland, there's a risk that there could be a road between those two wetlands. So for the past few years, we've also been conducting surveys along major roads in Eastern Ontario, stopping every time we find a turtle on the road, whether it's alive or dead. And for every turtle, we attempt to figure out what species it is. That's generally straightforward. We measure the turtle if it's dead and it's not too badly damaged. Sometimes we can establish whether it's a male or female as well. And most importantly, we want to know exactly where we found that turtle so that we can build a very large map of where turtles are found on the road. Now, many of those turtles on the road are unfortunately dead, but we also find live turtles on the road. And because of that, and because of us doing the surveys, we've actually rescued approximately 200 turtles that were on roads. Some of those turtles would have got across the road on their own without our help, but many would have been killed by cars just because of the nature of how busy our roads are. So we can take the data of all these turtle observations of turtles on roads and then put together a big map showing exactly where turtles are most often crossing roads. And we call those areas hotspots because it seems to be the right conditions for turtles to cross from one side of the road to another. Typically, those areas have a wetland on both sides of the road. So as I said, unfortunately, many of the turtles we find are dead on the road, and to date, we found over 1,600 dead turtles on roads. It's a staggering amount of roadkill. It is spread over multiple years, and it is a fairly large area, but it is still a staggering amount of roadkill. As you can see, roughly 75% of the turtles we find are painted turtles, but you can also see that more than 10% of the turtles we find on roads are Blandings turtle, which is the nationally endangered species. And in fact, it's also a globally endangered species. From this map, it looks like almost every road is just dead turtles everywhere, but that's a function of the scale of this map. When we zoom in, we can find out where the real hotspots are. And this is an example of actually the worst hotspot we have found in Eastern Ontario. We found 38 turtles in this short section of road. And in this aerial imagery, the light blue areas indicate wetlands. So it's an example, as I mentioned before, where you have wetlands on both sides of the road. This site turned out to be an easy site to work at in terms of road mitigation because it was wetland habitat on both sides of the road. There were no houses, no driveways, and things like that. Because if you want to install wildlife fencing, the presence of driveways makes it very, very difficult to install continuous road fencing. We were also lucky that in this case, there was a large drainage culvert under the road, which can act as a crossing structure for turtles. It's been well documented that turtles and many other aquatic or semi-aquatic species will make use of drainage culverts under roads, but they do have to be encouraged. If they can get onto the road, they will cross over the road rather than going through a culvert. So we worked with the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. This was a provincial road, and they agreed to install fencing at this hotspot and another hotspot that was also had a lot of roadkill at it. So that was the end of 2019. They installed this fencing at the two hotspots. So the fencing forms a solid barrier for the turtles. They can't get under the fence, they can't climb over the fence, but if they follow along the fence, they'll be guided towards the drainage culvert, and then they can cross under the road and get to the other wetland on that side of the road. So this happened at the end of 2019 when the fences went up. In 2020, we continued to do road surveys in this area, and we found absolutely no roadkill at the hotspot or near the hotspot. So it was clear that the fencing was completely successful. Remember, we had 36 dead turtles over 3 years, 2017 to 2019, and in 2020, none at all. So we were quite pleased at that. And there was also no roadkill at the other hotspot, the MTO fence for us. And just recently, we've had road fencing installed at a third hotspot. So this is now 3 spaces, 3 sections of road where turtles are protected from the road. It's a small start, but it is nice to actually have seen progress on the ground. The third broad category that we work on is trying to increase the reproductive success of turtles. And just to give everyone a basic review of this, as I've mentioned before, typically it's the month of June for the nesting season. The adult females will leave the wetlands and look for a place to lay their eggs. This is almost always an open area that gets lots of sunshine because the nest needs the warmth to develop. It can be a sandy area, like in this photograph, but often it's hard-packed gravel or substrate like that. Turtles can dig in a lot of different areas. So the female picks a site, she digs a hole in the ground, she lays her eggs, covers the eggs back up with the soil, packs down the soil, and the female walks away from the nest, heads back into the water, and that's the last care she will give her eggs. So turtles perhaps are not the best parents, but this is a strategy which has worked well for millions of years. The eggs, at least, are hidden from sight because they're covered with the soil. And after the turtle has finished packing down the soil, there's very little sign of a turtle nest for most species of turtles. However, just because they're hidden from sight does not mean they're hidden from scent. I'm sure most of you know we have species like raccoons and skunks and foxes, possibly even coyotes, that will find turtle nests, dig them up, and eat the eggs. And so if you ever see a sign like this, with a bunch of eggshells on the surface and a good size hole in the ground, you know it's a predated nest. A predator has got the eggs before they hatched out. If this was a nest that had hatched out, the eggshells would stay in the nest cavity and the hatchlings would make their way to the surface, generally leaving from a very small hole, which would be much, much smaller than you see here. So if you see eggshells on the surface, likely the nest was predated. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, nest predation is a natural phenomenon, and turtles are adapted to a certain level of nest predation. What's changed, however, is that species like raccoons have adapted very well to our societies. They like our cornfields. They like our compost bins. So raccoons are well fed, and this means that their populations have increased. And so also nest predation has also increased. So in some areas, you may only get 50% of nests predated by raccoons. In some areas, researchers are finding that 60, 70, even 80 or 90% of nests can be taken by predators. And when predation levels are that high, the population just cannot be sustained in the long term. You need the juveniles coming in for the next generation. So there's a few things we can do to help turtle nests. The first thing we've been doing is installing nest protectors on top of nests. So Here's Chris with a nest protector that we've built out of 2x4 frames covered with wire mesh on top. He's hammering in some spikes in the four corners of the nest protector. And if there are any handy big rocks around, we'll pile those in the corner of the protectors just to keep those raccoons out. We have to make sure that the center of the nest protector is wide open because we want the sunshine to warm up the soil and we want the rain to fall through the nest cage and into the nest. It's also important that our nest protectors have an exit hole, or actually put two exit holes in our nest protectors. So at the end of August or early September, the nest hatches out, the hatchlings make it to the surface. If there were no exit holes from the nest protector, all of a sudden your protector has become a cage and the hatchlings are trapped inside. If it's a hot day and bright and sunny, those hatchlings could die very quickly. So it's very important that they can exit the nest protector and make their way to water. Now the nest cages work pretty well overall. Sometimes the raccoons will get very keen to get into one and they will dig under a nest protector, but we've had pretty good success with them. Unfortunately, nest protectors can only be used in some locations. They can't be used, for example, along the shoulders of roads. Typically, most municipalities don't want nest cages on the road shoulder because it's a hazard for cars to have to pull off the road onto the road shoulder. And many turtles like to nest on road shoulders because it is open, it's sunny, and of course there's no vegetation growing in that shoulder right next to the paved road. So for those nests, we're actually going out, collecting the eggs, bringing them back to our lab and incubating them and then releasing the hatchlings. So typically that kind of nest survey and nest excavation work occurs at night when many turtles are nesting, but sometimes we find nests in the daytime and it's also much easier to take photographs of the process during the daytime. So here's an actual snapping turtle nest on a road shoulder. It's got that gravelly substrate there. We start with a hand trowel and remove the top couple of centimeters of gravel. And then from then on, we use our fingers to very gently dig down because we don't want to break any of the eggs. Once we dig down a few centimeters, we find the nest cage, and that's where the eggs will all be tightly together. And this is a snapping turtle nest. You can tell that because in Eastern Ontario, at least, snapping turtles are the only species that lay round eggs. They're pretty much the size and shape of a ping pong ball. Once we found the nest cavity, we very carefully take each egg from the nest, and we have to be very careful we don't rotate the eggs. So the eggs develop in the ground. They're not going to be disturbed in a natural incubation development process. So the turtle egg has a very distinct top and bottom to the egg, which develops a few hours after the eggs have been laid. If you rotate that egg, the embryo can become detached from an inner membrane of the egg. So we make sure we do not rotate the eggs. We take a blunt pencil and we write on the top of every egg. We give it a letter code to indicate which nest it is, A, B, C, etc., and then an individual number for each egg from that nest. So this is a nest of 30-some snapping turtle eggs, and then we place those eggs in a bin with soil and half bury the eggs into that soil so that they don't move or rotate before we take them back to the lab. Once we get back to CWF headquarters, we actually transfer the eggs from the substrate at the nesting site and transfer them into a container that's filled with vermiculite. Anyone who's a gardener will recognize vermiculite. It's an artificial potting soil. It holds moisture quite well, but it's also very resistant to mold. So occasionally we get an egg that is a bad egg. It goes moldy, and we don't want that mold to spread into the soil and to adjacent eggs. So the vermiculite keeps the mold from spreading through the soil, and that keeps our eggs safer. So we have a mixture of vermiculite and water. It goes into one of these high-tech Tupperware containers and then into our incubators. I want to stress that every nest goes in a separate container. We do not mix eggs from different nests into different containers. And if it's a very large nest, it may require 2 containers to take all the eggs. And there are holes in the containers to allow airflow. And then they're sealed up with a lid, and they go inside the incubator. Incubator is actually a pretty straightforward device. It has a heater, it has a fan, and it has a thermostat which controls the temperature, just like the thermostat in your house controls the temperature of your house. And the temperature of the eggs is vital for developing the eggs. If it's too cold, they're not going to develop. But for many species of turtles, temperature is even more important. So strange as it may seem, for many species of turtle, the temperature of the egg actually determines the sex of the offspring. This isn't true for all species, but it is true for most species of turtles that have been checked. And typically, cooler temperatures produce males, and warmer temperatures produce females. So this means we have to decide what temperature the incubator should be. If it's very warm, we're going to get all females, and if it's relatively cool, it's all males. Well, we're trying to mimic nature as much as possible, so we're aiming for roughly a 50-50 sex ratio. So we pick an in-between temperature that will likely provide roughly 50-50 males and females. We also know that road mortality affects males and females, so we're trying to make sure we produce both males and females in the population down the road. So for the next couple of months, we're taking care of our eggs. They get checked at least once a week. If we have eggs that have gone bad, if they're really moldy, then they get checked to make sure they're not viable, and if they're not, they get discarded. If the nest clutches have lost weight through evaporation, we can add water to the soil. And this, of course, just simulates rain falling on the nest. So we take good care of them. And in about 2 months, the eggs start to hatch. And at least before the pandemic, hatching day in the office is one of the most exciting days of the year, I think, for all the CWF staff. Someone comes running out of the office where the eggs are kept and saying, "They're hatching, they're hatching." And of course, it's a long process. It takes many, many days and weeks for all the nests to hatch, but there's always one nest which has to be first. Even an individual egg can take hours or perhaps more than a day to hatch. It may start off with a small crack in the eggshell. Sometimes, like in this picture, a foot pokes out of the little opening. And sometimes you just get the head and top of the body poking out of the shell. Certainly, they're quite adorable at this stage. This is a hatchling snapping turtle on its very first day of life. And sometimes the hatchlings will stay like this for a few hours as well. They'll be half in and half out. We typically give them as much time as they want. There's no point rushing them. And when they're ready, they will crawl out of the egg and on to the next stage of life. Once an individual nest starts to hatch, typically a lot of eggs will start hatching in the next day or two. And this photograph probably was taken first thing in the morning. We've come into the lab to check the eggs. And as you can see, a whole bunch of hatchlings have popped out overnight. This is a clutch of Blandings turtle eggs. You can see that the eggs are oval rather than spherical, like the snapping turtle eggs. So when we find a bunch of hatchlings in the vermiculite, each of the hatchlings gets taken out of that container. We brush off the vermiculite as much as possible, give them a little bit of a bath, and then put them in a container with shallow water, other hatchlings from that particular nest. Again, we never mix hatchlings from other nests. And this is about as many hatchlings as we would put in one container. If we have more than this hatch out, then again, we would have more than one container per clutch. And they would stay in this container until the rest of the eggs from that particular clutch have hatched. And that whole process from the first egg hatching out in one nest to the last egg hatching out in a nest can take a few days. And sometimes there may be a straggler which can push it to 4 or 5 days before that last egg has hatched out. This is a hatchling Blandings turtle. You can see even as soon as it leaves the nest or the egg, it already has the bright yellow throat of the adults. You will note in the middle of the bottom shell or plastron, there's this oval shaped feature, and that's called the Yolk Scar. So when the embryo is developing inside the egg, there's yolk attached to the embryo, and this is where the nutrients flow from the yolk into the turtle. Eventually, the turtle absorbs all those nutrients. There'll be this little opening which seals up, and then over the next few days and weeks, the shell will slowly close together, and eventually it will look like a normal adult turtle shell in terms of its hardness, and there'll be no sign that there was ever a yolk scar there. So you can kind of think of this as a turtle's belly button. So before we release the hatchlings, we measure and weigh them all just to make sure what their body condition is like, and we can keep track of any kind of not injuries, but developmental things that look not natural. And then once they've been measured and weighed, it's time to go back out into the wild. So I want to stress that each nest goes back to a wetland close to where the nest was laid. We don't move them to other areas. We're trying to help the local population from where that nest was laid. And I should stress that all this work is done under a number of different permits to collect the eggs and take care of them and to release them back into the wild. So we do not release the hatchlings at the nest site because remember, that was along the shoulder of the road. And if we release them on the road shoulder, the hatchlings might just go on the road and get hit by a car, and there's really no point for that. For Blandings turtles, like this little hatchling in the photograph, it's quite surprising that many times the Blandings turtle nests are not even within sight of water. It can be more than 100 meters away to the nearest wetland. So we help the hatchlings over that particular speed bump in life by making sure they go the right direction and releasing them at the water's edge. This way they're not being picked off by crows or ravens or other predators on their big journey to the water. So we release the hatchlings at the edge of the water, and typically they just swim out and then hide in the vegetation in the water. They seem to have an innate sense that they should hide, that they probably are food for everything. So over the past few years, we've released almost 1,400 hatchlings, which we're very proud of. And the bottom left-hand photograph shows some Blandings Turtle hatchlings, and then the top right photograph is a northern map turtle. Last year was the first year we collected and hatched out northern map turtle eggs. It was very exciting for us. You can see our numbers on the screen here, and you can see that we've released a lot more snapping turtles than anything else. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, snapping turtles lay a lot more eggs than any other turtle, at least around here. The largest clutch we found so far has been over, I think it was 61 eggs, which is a huge, huge number. In contrast, the other species are laying 10 or 15 eggs on average. Also, it's much easier to find a snapping turtle nest than other nests, so that makes it easier for us to find those nests. So those are a few of the ways we're trying to give turtles a helping hand. We are making small, but I think clear progress to benefiting some of these populations. We know roadkill is still a major threat in areas that we have not been able to address roadkill. And we know the hatchlings that we've released won't compensate for all of that roadkill, but we are hopefully moving in the right direction. There's lots more that we can do and hope to do in future years, but there's lots more that anyone can do to help turtles. So for example, all of us who are driving around as the pandemic allows can watch for turtles. There have already been reports of turtles on the road in Eastern Ontario and Southern Ontario, so turtles are on the move already. If you see a turtle trying to cross the road and it's safe to do so, you should pull off onto the road shoulder, put on your four-way flashers, and just like your mom said, look both ways before you cross onto the road. Always take your own personal safety as the prime concern. Many cars are traveling quite fast, and some drivers are distracted, so you have to be very careful if you're trying to rescue a turtle off the road. We recommend grabbing the turtle with two hands to move it off the road. The turtle may scratch at you, it may pee on you, and if you've got two hands on it, you're less likely to drop it, which the turtle would appreciate. And it's very important to always move the turtle in the direction it's heading. He or she knows where it wants to go, so make sure you move it in that direction. You may also find injured turtles at the side of the road. And if you're in the province of Ontario, we encourage you to contact the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre. Their phone number is here, and you can also find them on the web by Googling them. And they have a volunteer turtle taxi system for people to pick up turtles across the province and bring them to their headquarters in Peterborough. And it's important to stress that for turtles, sometimes you can't easily tell whether it's alive or dead. Sometimes, without getting too graphic, it's really obvious the turtle has been flattened, it's dead. But sometimes the shell may be cracked, there may be a lot of blood, and the turtle may be unresponsive, but that doesn't mean the turtle's dead. I've talked with the lead veterinarian at the Turtle Center, and even they have been surprised at some turtles that come in, they're completely unresponsive, but they give them some first aid, and the turtle starts to move. So if there's any doubt when you find an injured turtle on the road, assume it's alive and contact the Turtle Center. Moving turtles off the road is generally straightforward. Snapping turtles are a different kettle of turtles, so to speak. You have to be very, very careful handling turtles, snapping turtles. And if you're not comfortable with that, there are a number of ways you can move them off the road without touching them. You can use a shovel if you happen to have one in your trunk, or if you have an old blanket, you can toss it over the turtle and drag it off the road. The turtle might get a bit scratched up, but that's better than being hit by a car. We've created a video on how to move a snapping turtle off the road, and you can check out the video on our website, helptheturtles.ca. But you really have to know exactly where to place your hands because the turtle's head can move quite a ways back. So you do need to know what you're doing to help a snapping turtle. But as I said, there are other methods for moving them off the road that do not involve grabbing the turtle. For those people that own land and own land with wetlands, obviously protecting those wetlands benefits turtles for generations to come. If you have turtles nesting around your house or on your land, you could consider building some nest protectors. And again, we have a PDF flyer that gives you step-by-step guidance on building a nest protector on our website. You can download that. It's not very difficult to do. You do not need to be an expert carpenter. It's very inexpensive, $10 or $20 of material if you have to buy a 2x4, and otherwise it's almost free to build one of these things. We also encourage people to join iNaturalist if you haven't done that and submit your observations of turtles. We have a project called Help the Turtles. And you recall I've mentioned for Blandings turtles, if you find one in a new area, an area not previously documented, this provides additional habitat protection for the species. And this is true for iNaturalist observations. So if you see a Blandings turtle and take a photo of it using the iNaturalist app, get the location from the app and post it to iNaturalist, the government of Ontario will actually keep track of those Blandings turtle observations, and that helps to protect habitat. It's that simple. You do not have to be a professional to protect Blandings turtle habitat. If you happen to be in the Muskoka area, we have a partner group that we work with there called the START Project. START stands for Saving Turtles at Risk Today, and they have a hotline. So particularly if you see a nesting turtle, you can call the hotline and they will send a team out as soon as possible. Like us, they collect eggs and incubate them, and they will try to collect that nest and incubate it. So there's many ways people can help. I hope this has been interesting. Last but not least, I need to thank the many, many summer staff we've had over the past few years. We could not have done all this amazing work without the help of all these wonderful people I've had the privilege of working with. And I'm happy to take any questions that people have. I think officially the webinar runs until 1 p.m., but I'm happy to stick around if there's more questions, and I can talk turtles all the time.
Great, thank you, Dave. I learned a lot in that webinar today. We do have a few questions, so I will get started. We had a question, would you be able to explain why there is a high hatchling mortality rate?
So in nature, the hatchlings are very tiny. They're the size of a toonie with legs. So at that size, basically, they can be eaten by a wide range of predators. Hatchlings are pretty good at hiding, but they can be eaten by aquatic predators like large fish, um, snakes, great blue herons. They're just snack food for a lot of different things until they get to a larger size.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, can turtles live in wetlands invaded by Phragmites?
That's a great question. So Phragmites, for those not familiar, it's a non-native grass. You may have seen it driving along certain highways. It can be 2 or 3 meters tall and has a big wavy tuft at the top. And it gets into some wetlands and can completely take over the wetland. And there's certainly a lot of concerns that it degrades the quality of the wetland. There's not going to be as much sunshine getting down to the base of the Phragmites. There's been some research. I just read a recent paper this week that found, at least for this population at this one site, the turtles were actually moving through the Phragmites and they were not as affected as the researchers expected. So we don't know for sure, but I'm sure it does have effect on nest sites and the temperature of nest sites, and also just the overall biodiversity of the wetlands, which could affect. So if it affects the prey the turtles eat, then that could have an indirect effect. So invasive species, I think it's safe to say they're not good for our native turtles. We just don't know how bad they are.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, are these Canadian turtle species found in other places?
Yes, good question. And all of our species in Canada are also found south of us in the United States. And some of them are quite widespread in the US, and others are not so widespread. So the Blandings turtle, for example, is just found pretty much around the Great Lakes Basin. So we might think that turtles would love it further south, down in Florida, where it's summer for a long time. But turtles like the Blandings turtle actually prefer kind of a temperate climate. And so that's one reason the Blandings turtle is not just an endangered species in Canada, it's a globally endangered species because it's found in such a small area of North America. But most of our species are found much further south. So the painted turtle is found across most of the US. Snapping turtle is very widespread as well.
Awesome. So we have a couple hands raised as well. So John Sana, I hope I said your last name correctly. I'm going to take you off mute to ask your question. Okay, you should be ready to go.
I think John's still muted.
Aha, he can hear. So I've allowed you to talk. So if you just press the mute button at the bottom of your screen, you can take yourself off mute to ask the question. And if that doesn't work for any reason, you can always ask it in the Q&A box as well. Okay, it looks like there might be some technical difficulties. So for now, I'm going to go on to the next question, and we'll see if it works in a minute. So our next question is, do other provinces protect wetlands if a species is at risk and it's photographed in the GPS location indicated? This person asked because they're in BC and interested in Western painted turtles.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And wildlife habitat is typically protected at the provincial level, and it does vary dramatically across the country. I'm not sure of the details in BC, but so painted turtles are a strange one because they're found in BC, they're found in the East Coast and across most of Canada. And there's a whole bunch of painted turtles right on the west coast of Canada, around Vancouver and Vancouver Island. And that area of painted turtles have been, I think it's listed as threatened species. So I think in those areas, there's more protection for the habitat. And I'm not sure if that's coming from the provincial government or the federal government, but there's a fair amount of cooperation between the two. So it's still worthwhile to record those observations, particularly in BC for the painted turtle, because it's a species at risk and the biologists want to know where they are to figure out which populations are at risk or more at risk. And so it's still very valuable to do and record those observations.
Great. We have a lot of questions, so I am
Sure,
picking ones that a lot of people ask the same type of question. So have the turtles been marked or tagged?
So I'm presuming that's asking about the hatchlings, and we do not do that for a number of reasons. We certainly have thought about it, and I get asked this question a lot too. Typically, the wetlands are roadside wetlands where we can release them, but that doesn't mean it's public land. The wetland itself could be on private land. So we're releasing them at the roadside at the edge of the wetland, but to be able to go back in there a year or two later and try to catch those same hatchlings would be very difficult. It would take possibly days and days of work, and you probably still would miss a large number. So it would be very hard to know how many have survived over the first winter or the second year, for example. It would be wonderful to know. And so, yes, it would be great to do, but just given limitations of time, we chose not to do that. And we know that the main risk is at the egg stage, and then there's probably significant risk at that stage where the hatchling makes the trek from the nest to water. So we know the turtles have gotten over those two really big speed bumps in their life, and then it's up to them. But it would be interesting to mark some and then come back 20 years later and say, yes, we remember you, but it's a long time, 20 years to come back to find that turtle.
Great, thank you. We had a few questions about how long turtles live, the different species in our country, and what the average age is.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the short answer is we don't know for certain because turtles are very, very long-lived. There's pretty good evidence that Blandings turtles can live more than 80 years. There was a long-term study in Michigan, and I think it was going on for 40 some years, and they had some adults at the beginning of the project, and those adults were still there at the end of the project. And I believe they went back a couple years ago and caught one that had been first marked. I think it was over 60 years ago, and it was an adult at that stage, so they figured it had to be over 80 years old. So, and maybe more than that, it's quite possible they could make it to the century mark. There are box turtles, which occur in the United States, but not as far north as Canada. And every once in a while, someone finds a really, really old box turtle. And on the bottom of the shell, someone will have carved their initials and a date. And the date will be something like 1912. And people think, well, this could be fake, but the turtle looks really, really old. And you can tell the date is really, really old in terms of when it was carved in. So it's pretty compelling evidence that at least sometimes they can make it that old, but we don't know for sure how long they can live, but definitely decades.
Great. We have a few questions also on how many eggs are laid and also how deep the holes are.
Right. So the number of eggs depends upon the size of the turtle. So our smallest turtles are the eastern musk turtle and the spotted turtle. And the typical nest size for those two species is somewhere between 3, 4, 5 eggs. It's a very, very small clutch because it's a very small turtle. And then on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the snapping turtle is the biggest species. And a typical clutch that we find is somewhere between 25 and 35 eggs. But like I said, I think the biggest clutch we've had was 61. So it's quite a range. And I mean, no surprise, the number of eggs is going to be connected to how big the female is. So keep in mind with turtles, they have that hard shell. So the female has all these eggs developing in her body, but she can't get any physically bigger because it's a hard shell. So there's a real limit to how many eggs can fit inside. In terms of the depth of the nest, again, that's also connected to the size of the turtle. So a bigger turtle, got longer legs, can dig a deeper hole. And if you're a snapping turtle laying 40 or 50 eggs, that's got to be a good size hole. Smaller turtles like the painted turtle, it may only be 5 to 10 centimeters down to where the eggs are laid.
Great. Oh, I've never thought about that before, that their body size can't change.
Mm-hmm.
We also had questions about, can you recognize a turtle nest that's on the side of the road as a member of the public?
Yeah, so for most of our species, I'm going to say all the species except the snapping turtle, once the turtle is gone, you can't recognize the nest. And this is to the point where if you're watching from 100 meters away, as we often are, and the turtle has finished nesting and left, and it's dark out, you approach where she was, where we often have a hard time pinpointing the nest. We know it's somewhere in this 2 or 3 meters, but we can't see any signs of the nest. And that's within 5 minutes of the female finished laying her eggs. That makes it very difficult to find the nest unless the female has been laying. Snapping turtles are a little bit different because they dig up so much soil when they lay their nest and displace the soil. Sometimes there's signs of digging and signs of dug up soil beside the nest. And once you learn to recognize that, you can find snapping turtle nests after they've been laid. And that's why we've been able to find more snapping turtle nests. But they are very good at disguising their nests from sight. They just can't figure out how to hide the scent of their nest. Great.
I was just having a look through the questions, and there's a lot of questions about other provinces. Do they have help centers that someone can call if they find a nest, if they find an injured turtle? Specifically, BC was mentioned a few times, and Quebec as well.
Yeah, so Ontario is very, very lucky to have the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre. It's a world-class rehab center, but all provinces do have rehab centers. We've been trying to put together a list of different rehab centers, and it is difficult because a lot of rehab centers specialize with mammals or birds. So we do not have a long list or even a short list of places that are good at dealing with injured turtles. Some rehab centers will take in eggs. So for example, we get phone calls about a turtle laid its egg in my driveway or my garden. What are we going to do? And so in those cases, sometimes the rehab center, if it has the right permits, can collect the eggs and incubate them. But I cannot give you individual names. In BC, there's a few wildlife centers. You can contact them. And likely in any province, you could contact either your Ministry of Natural Resources or Department of Wildlife, whatever it's called in your province, and they would know best what's going on in your particular area. And we should do better in trying to find out what's going on in other provinces. I will say that we also, as another side project I didn't mention today, sometimes turtles get hooked on fishing lines. The turtle will see the worm on the hook and will bite onto that hook, and sometimes they actually swallow that hook, which is a pretty serious medical issue. So we have some flyers about what to do if you hook a turtle on your fishing line, and we have figured out a few places that will take turtles that have been caught on a hook and the hook is deeply in there. So you can check our website for that. And we now have a place in Manitoba that will take hooked turtles. So they probably also will take injured turtles, but I'm not sure. And we also have found a place in the Okanagan in BC. And I think there's the Atlantic Wildlife Center in the Maritimes that will take in hooked turtles and possibly injured turtles. We have not yet found a place in Quebec, which we've been working for, because they do have a lot of turtles there as well. If anyone does find anything, please contact CWF and let us know, because we've tried a few places and they just said they can't deal with that. So I wish I had a better answer, but there are some resources out there online if you look around, but you may have to look to find.
Great, thank you. Just looking through the questions now, and there's also been a few questions about the possibility of training dogs to sniff out nests, and if that's an idea we've ever thought of.
It does. Yeah, it should work for nests. I haven't read as much about that. People have used sniffer dogs to find turtles, primarily more terrestrial ones. So Blandings turtles that are on land. And there's also the wood turtle, which is very terrestrial, and people have used well-trained dogs to find those. They should be able to find nests as well. You'd have to narrow down the area and have a sense that I think they typically nest in this, this stretch of road or along this wetland, and then you could use the dog to find the nest. Obviously, labor intensive. You have to have a trained dog. I'm not sure if the dog would just be trained on the scent of one turtle or whether it could be trained to respond to snapping turtles and Blandings turtles, and that I don't know, but it's certainly an intriguing idea.
Great, thank you. Definitely something to think about. We do have a few other questions to go. So if you guys would like to stay, please feel free. Someone was saying they saw a post recently that said do not hold turtles on their sides because it hurts them to do that. Do you have a comment on that? And is it possible to hold one hand on top and one hand underneath?
I think I know the post this person's talking about because I saw it too and added my comments to it. So I'll repeat what I said there. I have been working with turtles for over 20 years, and I've never heard the comment that you should not grab the turtle by its sides. It is certainly true you should not pick up a turtle by its tail. And I think probably in the 1950s and 60s, there was a lot of material out there about catching snapping turtles, typically for eating them. And you would see photos or drawings of people holding a snapping turtle by its tail. And so some people thought you could do that and it was okay and not harmful, but it can damage the vertebrae because the tail, of course, is attached to the backbone and the vertebrae. So it can really hurt the turtle. So sometimes there gets some confusion over different messages. Someone says you shouldn't pick up a turtle by its tail, and someone hears that, and maybe a year later they've said, yeah, you're not supposed to pick it up a certain way. Maybe it's not by the sides. But there's no harm from picking it up from the sides. As you said, Jed, you could use one hand underneath and one hand on top. I find that a bit awkward. I think it's easier to kind of grab it from both sides. It's kind of like the sandwich holding it or the hamburger grip. You got your fingers underneath. It's very, very simple hold, aside from the snapping turtles where you don't want to do that. But I saw this post a week or so ago. I've talked to a few friends and asked them and said, have you ever heard this? And no, it's definitely not. So I have double checked just to make sure that I was just not wrong for 20 years. But no, if you think of the shell of a turtle, it's bone, it's hard bone, and then it's covered with scute material, which is kind of like our fingernails. So it's a hard, rigid structure, and there's no harm doing it. I mean, if someone picks you up by the hips, they're grabbing you by your bones. If they're strong enough to lift you up, it's not going to hurt you. So there's definitely no harm in picking up a turtle that way, but definitely don't pick it up by the tail.
Great, thank you. On the subject of holding turtles, should you just help them cross the road, or should you bring them to the body of water when you're helping a turtle?
So the official wildlife policy for species at risk is that you're not supposed to harm or harass species at risk. So if the animal is in imminent danger, for example, being on a road, moving it off the road is doing a net positive thing. If the wetland is 2 or 3 meters down the slope of the road shoulder and you take it down there, that's fine. If the road shoulder is 1 kilometer down the road and you if you put the turtle in your trunk and drive down the road, all of a sudden you're in violation of some species at risk stuff because you're now in possession of a species at risk. And moving it that far, who knows if that's the wetland it wants to be in. So I always encourage people to release it as soon as possible, right off the side of the road. Not on the road shoulder, so it might come back on, but yeah, 2 or 3 meters off the shoulder, but right straight in the direction the turtle is moving. But that's a very good question.
Great. We have a question from 6-year-old Naomi, and she wanted to know, what color are snapping turtles?
That's a good question. Well, there just happens to be a picture of a snapping turtle on the screen right now. This is a hatchling poking its head out. So you can see it's mainly black, and it has little white flecks in it. And as the turtle gets older and bigger, the color changes somewhat. It can be kind of a dark gray or maybe a dark brown. A lot of big snapping turtles, because they spend almost their entire life in the water, actually will have algae growing on top of the shell. So sometimes they end up having a green shell because they have stuff growing on top of them. But without that, they're typically black or gray or brown. But thanks for the question. And thanks for listening to our webinar.
Oh, that's great. Also with snapping turtles, is there any concern that the higher number of snapping turtle hatchlings released may alter the balance of different turtle species over time? And do turtle species compete for the same resources?
Well, those are great questions. I don't think there's any risk that we're going to be knee-deep in turtles in 20 years. We know they do face lots of threats, as I've outlined today. So those hatchlings have to survive for 15 or 20 years before they can breed. And it's quite likely that a lot of those hatchlings will not make it, but some of them will. I doubt we're shifting the balance by very much. And I'm sorry, part 2 of the question was?
Just give me 1 second to find it again. There's a lot of questions. The second part was, do turtles compete for the same resources, different species?
Right. As far as we know, turtles aren't competing a lot for resources. Um, Anyone who's been in areas with lots of painted turtles will see them basking on logs, and you might see 20 or 30 turtles basking on one log. Now, sometimes if you wait long enough, you'll see one turtle climb up on the log and push another turtle off the log because he or she wants that particular basking spot. So you can say there's a bit of competition going on for the best basking spots. I'm not sure that's a big source of competition. And turtles are omnivores. They eat a wide range of things. They eat plant material. They will eat insects, aquatic invertebrates. Some of them, like snapping turtles, will eat things like dead fish, which is a valuable service to clean up our wetlands. Most of the things they eat aren't rare, so I think there's lots of food for those species. But something I would add is that in many parts of Canada, particularly southern Ontario and southern BC, we're now seeing lots of red-eared sliders out in nature. So the red-eared slider is it's a non-native species to Canada. It's found in the American southeast or central east, but not as far north as Canada naturally. But it's been the big turtle in the pet trade. And you can still buy them in the pet trade, and they're typically the size of a loony or toonie. So they're very, very cute. But they can grow to be 20 or 25 centimeters in length. And at that size, they need a huge aquarium. And a lot of people decide to release them into the wild at that point or before that point. And so there's concern that this non-native species could be competing with our native species. Although if we go further south, where the red-eared slider is native, most of our species coexist with sliders down in those areas. Nonetheless, particularly in some urban wetlands, people are starting to see more sliders than painted turtles. And so that may be a sign that things are shifting. Maybe it's just the large number of sliders being released. But it is a concern. I don't know if that competition is even a big threat at that level. But I really encourage anyone who does have a pet slider not to release them into the wild, because you don't know what your turtle may have. It may appear healthy, but it could be carrying a disease. If it gets released into the wild, it's now spreading that disease someplace it doesn't belong. We're currently all living on under a pandemic situation where diseases have moved around the world, and we know what that can cause. There was a recent case in Australia where one species of turtle, which had a very, very small distribution, a new virus, apparently a new virus, moved into that area and killed off a large percentage of the population. We don't know exactly what happened, but it's a very, very sobering and a dramatic example of what can happen when a disease comes into a new area. So my biggest fear from the endangered species, invasive species point of view is if some very lethal virus gets released into the Vancouver area or the Toronto area, it could kill off a bunch of our native species. And that would be very tragic.
Yes, I very much agree. On the topic of sliders, I saw somebody was asking about crossbreeding between sliders and painted turtles. And does this happen? And have you seen it?
As far as I know, sliders will not breed with painted turtles, but I think there are reports of sliders crossbreeding with other species further south that they're more closely related to. So I don't think that's an issue in the wild. However, I should point out that in southwestern Ontario and in extreme southern BC, there have been examples of sliders in the wild that have laid eggs, and those eggs have hatched out. So it's possible for sliders to breed in at least the warmest parts of Canada.
Great, thank you. We have another question, and it was about how do you know what's a female, what's a male? How do you sex turtles?
That's a great question. And, for a lot of birds, it's really obvious. The male cardinal is bright red and the female is not quite as showy. For turtles, typically it's pretty hard to tell the boys from the girls. For some species, there are some subtle differences in the coloration, but you have to be pretty close to see them. For the painted turtle, which is the most widespread species, one of the biggest differences, which again, you've got to be pretty close to see, but the male painted turtles have very long fingernails on their front feet or hands. And the females have much shorter claws. And the males actually use their claws when they're courting females, and they use them to kind of stroke or tickle the female's face. So side by side, the difference is quite striking. The male claws are about 1 centimeter in length, and the female is only about 0.5 centimeter, but that's hard to see from a distance. For some species, but not all, so for example, for the Blandings turtle, the bottom shell of the turtle can help indicate whether it's a male or a female. The females have a flat bottom shell, and the males have more of a concave bottom shell. So the female's flat shell kind of maximizes the amount of space inside her body for the eggs. And a third thing that's true for most species has to do with the tail. For males, the tail tends to be a bit thicker and longer, but again, unless you have the male and female side by side, it's really hard to say for sure. So it's definitely not easy, which is the case for some birds, right? So robins are very hard to tell apart, males and females, and the same is true for most of our turtles.
Great, thank you. It's almost 1:30, so I'm only going to take a couple more questions. One of them was, how do you know if the same turtle is coming back year after year, and is it typical for turtles to return to the same nesting site every year?
That's a good question. And we know from not our studies, but other people's research that a lot of freshwater turtles will come back to the same general area year after year to nest, but not always. So sometimes they will go to a completely different area. And by that, I don't mean miles and miles away, but they may nest on the south side of the wetland one year and the north side of the wetland the next year. And it's really hard to know why they will do that, but we know turtles will quickly make use of new nesting environments. If you think about it, we know our turtles will live for decades, and an adult female will keep on breeding for probably most, if not her entire life. So if she always nested in the same spot for 50 years, at the beginning of that time period, the area might be nice and open and sunny. After 20 years, there could be lots of shrubs. And after 30 years, there could be trees growing there. So she has to adapt to the situation. So people have actually created artificial or new nesting habitat for turtles. And if it's in a good location, so kind of where the turtle's likely to find it, it's been pretty clearly shown that turtles will nest there within a year or two of the site being created. So turtles they're picky, but they're not really picky about where they nest. In contrast, they're extremely picky about where they hibernate. And so if a turtle hibernates in this particular wetland, it will go back there year after year because it knows that's a safe place to spend the winter. If I go someplace else, maybe it's not going to be safe. And if a turtle picks the wrong wetland to overwinter in, and it's a cold winter, the pond may freeze to the bottom and actually kill turtles in the wetland. So it's a life or death decision as to where to hibernate. Whereas laying the eggs, it's like, find a good spot. It meets these criteria. This is good enough. There's probably more to it than that we don't understand, but we do know they're very flexible in terms of where they will lay their eggs.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. So I think we have time for one more question. And it's about species at risk. How can they be protected from urban developments, especially with private land involved?
Yeah, so that's a big question, and I can't address it fully. So it does vary from province to province how things work. Typically, at least the way the process is supposed to work, we'll say that someone wants to perhaps destroy a wetland to build something, a new business, a complex of something, and their proposal should be reviewed by the government, and it gets flagged as being in species at risk habitat. And at that point, there's supposed to be some negotiation between the government and the developer. And the government may say, well, we'd rather you didn't destroy the wetland. Maybe it's possible to work beside it, but not the wetland, and they can come to some kind of agreement. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes there's going to be a trade-off. And so there may be permission to develop this small wetland. Maybe it's already in a suburban area where it's surrounded by other houses and the habitat quality is not great. And so you're given permission to develop this area, but to do so, you must do something good for the species someplace else. And so for an example of that is that sometimes developers will pay for wildlife fencing to go up in an area where there's known high road mortality in exchange for being allowed to develop someplace else. It is a very, very complicated situation. And, we all want places to live, and we need stores and factories and things like this. So it is a balancing act trying to recognize the rights of individuals and society as well as species at risk. Sometimes it works quite well, and I'll be honest and say sometimes it doesn't work as well as it could. But I still want to stress that any level of habitat protection means that at least that process occurs. And so the development probably will have less effect because the process goes through by knowing the species at risk are there. The impact will likely be less, or there will be benefit to the species someplace else. So not surprisingly, no system is perfect, but I have seen some great examples of everyone working together and coming up with an outcome that everyone can live with.
Great. Thank you for all of the very interesting information today. And thank you everybody for coming to this webinar and sticking out an extra half an hour to go through questions. So I think we're good to go.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I mean, it's been fun to talk to people. I mean, it would be nice to see everyone as well. But thank you so much for attending the webinar, and I really encourage you to check out our website, helptheturtles.ca, where you can find out more resources and perhaps answer more of your questions about turtles. So thank you very much, and take care and be safe, everyone.